As mentioned, electrolytes aren't the only substances that are dissolved in water. Other substances include things like urea, protein, glucose, creatinine, and bilirubin. These just aren't called electrolytes because they don't carry the electrical charge. Page 194, under transport of water and electrolytes, it starts by describing membranes. And in the highlighted blue there, it says membranes are selectively permeable. And this is important because when it comes to dissolved substances in our bodies, size does matter. And the size of the dissolved particles is what makes them either able to or able not to cross these membranes. And so things like I mentioned over here, the protein and glucose, those are larger. And so a lot of times they can't cross through a membrane, whereas the dissolved electrolytes, being smaller, can. And of course, water is very small, and so usually the water has no problem crossing the membrane. And so a lot of times what you'll see is it's the water that moves in and out of the spaces rather than the things. And so if there's more stuff in one compartment and less stuff in another, then the water is going to move towards the more stuff to kind of like making it more dilute, I guess you might think of it. And we'll get into that more as we go on. Membranes maintain a unique composition of each compartment of the body while allowing the transport of nutrients and wastes to and from cells. And I already talked about how some solids can cross membranes more easily than others. So let's talk about the different types of transportation. And the four I'm going to talk about are diffusion, active transport, filtration, and osmosis. And again, you might be thinking, oh my gosh, this takes me back to like 7th grade science. And it kind of does, where we talked about diffusion and osmosis. And we're going to talk about those same things, only this time we're thinking of it from the point of view of a nurse in nursing processes and the things that can go wrong with human health related to these different types of transportation processes. So the first one is diffusion. And when I was in junior high and taking these science tests, I knew that this was going to be the most likely answer if I had this as a choice, because it seems like this is the way most things move, is by diffusion. And that's probably true, from an area of high concentration or natural tendency, as I have here, to an area of lower concentration. If I were to spray some perfume and we waited a moment, it would gradually diffuse throughout the room, and the people at the back of the room would be able to smell it eventually, if it didn't become so dilute by the time it reached back there that you couldn't smell it anymore. But that's diffusion. It doesn't require any energy. And facilitated diffusion has a carrier protein that transports the molecules through the membranes, but it's still considered diffusion. Even though it has this helper, it doesn't really require energy. Again, it's moving from areas of high concentration to areas of lower concentration. Then we have active transport. This is when we have these helpers, these same carrier proteins, but they're going to transport substances from an area of lower concentration to an area of equal or greater concentration. And this requires expenditure of energy. So things like sodium, potassium, glucose, and hydrogen, all of those are actively transported across cell membranes. Then we have filtration. Now, filtration, we're mainly going to be talking about the kidneys, but if you were to substitute the word pressure for concentration, then filtration has the same definition as diffusion, but we just substitute the word pressure. So it's the transfer of water and solids through a membrane from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure, rather than high concentration to an area of low concentration. And anytime you've drawn something up in a syringe, you've observed how this works, because when the liquid stays in the syringe even against gravity when you hold the syringe upright, but you just have to apply just a little bit of pressure on the plunger, and whatever liquid you have drawn up in the syringe squirts out, right? Because it's moving from that higher pressure that you're applying to the lower pressure. And that's how filtration works. It's a combination. Now, gravity also exerts some pressure, so we have to take that into account when we're talking about filtration. But so when our kidneys are working properly, then the pumping action of the heart gives us what we call a blood pressure, right? That the blood, as it flows through our body, is under pressure, and that's what forces it past these membranes that are in the kidney. So we call that process filtration. Then our final one that we're going to talk about is osmosis. That's probably the one that's maybe most familiar to you. And when we're talking about osmosis, it's water only. So it's a movement across a membrane from less concentration to more concentrated solution. It involves the movement of water only. So if a fluid compartment has less water and more sodium, water from another compartment is going to move into the compartment that has the more sodium. And that's why we say that the water always follows the salt, because it's always going to try to stay in balance. And it seems like water is the thing that moves the most or the easiest, and so that's where osmosis comes into play. The term osmolality, it sounds kind of scary, but all it's talking about is how concentrated something is. So the concentration of solution, and it's determined by particles per kilogram of water. So it has to do with mass or weight. And we're just talking about how strong the Kool-Aid is, basically, when we're talking about osmolality. The osmolality of intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid tends to equalize because the water constantly shifts. And if you're worried about getting it confused with this other term, osmolarity, don't worry about it. It's basically the same thing. It's still talking about how concentrated something is. The only difference is that we use different units of measure, and so instead of particles per kilogram, it refers to particles per liter. So how many particles are there in a volume versus how many particles are there in a mass is the only difference between osmolality and osmolarity. But both, you could say, is how concentrated something is. In the human body, the kidney is the organ that's the boss of the fluid balance. They control extracellular fluid by adjusting the concentration of specific electrolytes, and they do this through the process of filtration, and they work real closely with the circulatory system. When it comes to the kidney, and like I said, it's the boss of the fluid balance, but the manager inside the kidney you could think of is the nephron. Nephron is the functioning unit of the kidney. The glomerulus is the filtering portion of the nephron, and the tubule is what's responsible for secretion and reabsorption. So the nephron conducts the work of the kidney through filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. And we'll talk about each of those processes one by one. So with filtration, I already talked a little bit about that. But with filtration, the blood plasma enters the kidney through this renal artery. And we know from A&P that when blood's in an artery, it's under pressure, right? So that's where we get the pressure that's required for filtration, because in order for filtration to take place, it has to move from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. About 20% of the plasma is filtered into this apparatus called a glomerular capsule. It's just another functioning part of the kidney. Most remaining plasma leaves the kidney through the renal vein. The filtrate then moves through the tubules where it is transformed into urine by tubular reabsorption and secretion. And it can get kind of confusing as to what's being reabsorbed and what's being secreted. I have here that the kidneys adjust the volume and composition of the filtrate and prevent excessive fluid loss. So first, let's talk about reabsorption. It's the process by which most of the filtrate is returned to circulation. And when I'm talking about circulation, I'm talking about in the blood vessels. So it would return into the vein because it comes in through an artery. The water and selected solids move from the tubules into the capillaries, so there would be again returned into circulation. But not all of it returns. So the waste products remain in the tubules for excretion. Most of the water and most of the sodium gets reabsorbed and enters back into circulation. And for the rest of this lecture, when I say circulation, just know that I'm talking about the bloodstream and the blood vessels, this exchange that happens at the capillary level. The kidneys are able to adjust volume and composition of the filtrate and prevent excessive fluid loss through the kidneys. So they can decide if they need to reabsorb more water or excrete more water. And when we're talking about reabsorption, where it gets confusing is you think, well, is it being reabsorbed, meaning it's going to be absorbed into the urine, or is it being reabsorbed, meaning it's not going to be absorbed into the urine? And I mean the second one. If it's reabsorbed, it doesn't enter the urine. Okay, that's excretion. So everything that gets reabsorbed remains in the body. Everything that does not get reabsorbed is passed on eventually into the toilet. Now, I'm not going to show you the movie clip in this, but if you're in class, I'm going to show you a movie clip from one of my favorite movies of all time, which is Dune. And the purpose is these little suits that they're wearing, they're called still suits. And I love the explanation that they give in the movie of how the still suits work. It's basically to help people survive in the desert. And each of these pockets reabsorbs the water so that absolutely no water is wasted. And they talk about how you can lose water through respiration and through urine and feces and all of that. And this suit, special suit that they created, was to reclaim all of the water. And that's just to help understand how when we're talking about reabsorption, I don't mean being reabsorbed in that way. I'm talking about going back into blood circulation. Tubular secretion is the last phase, and so when things don't get reabsorbed, they go into these tubules for secretion, and they get transformed into urine, which I said goes into the toilet eventually. Various substances, a lot of the drugs that we've talked about, and when you read in your drug books, they say you can't take them if you have any type of kidney disorder. Hydrogen ions, potassium ions, creatinine, histamine, all pass from the blood into the tubules, and that's how these substances get eliminated. And it also is how we maintain a fluid and electrolyte balance in our body. How the kidneys know whether to excrete or reabsorb has a lot to do with these little chemical messengers called hormones. One of the hormones that has a lot to do with how much water gets reabsorbed is renin. Renin is a hormone that gets secreted when the blood volume or blood pressure falls, and renin causes the release of this other hormone, aldosterone, with subsequent sodium and water retention. And so if someone needs to retain water, then the hormone renin might be secreted, and that would add to the volume of the blood. Aldosterone acts on the kidney tubules to increase reabsorption of sodium and decrease reabsorption of potassium. And because the retention of sodium causes water retention, aldosterone also acts as a volume regulator. So both of these, renin and aldosterone, will cause the body to hang on to sodium, and therefore anytime you're hanging on to sodium, you're going to hang on to water as well. So if you were not wanting to retain water, like you were already swollen or you already had high blood pressure, you wouldn't want too much of this on board. But these are good things to have if you need to increase your blood pressure for some reason. Another one along the same lines is antidiuretic hormone. And this one's difficult to understand because it's a negative, antidiuretic, so against diuresis. So this is also going to cause the capillaries to reabsorb more water. Antidiuretic hormone doesn't have a lot to do with the sodium, so that's one way to tell them apart from the renin. It just acts on the water. But like these other two that we discussed back here, again, antidiuretic hormone is going to ultimately lead in the reabsorption of water, raising the blood pressure. And ANF is different. It's caused by the release from the atrium in the heart. It stimulates the excretion of sodium and water by the kidneys and decreased synthesis of renin and decreased release of aldosterone, vasodilation. So this A and F will result in a reduced blood volume and lower the blood pressure. And it's caused when that atrium of the heart senses, uh-oh, we're under too much pressure. We need to reduce the pressure.